The old mop made a soft swishing sound as it moved across the marble floor of Hartwell Academy of Music in Boston, Massachusetts, and the woman pushing it kept her eyes down as 3 young students rushed past her without a single glance in her direction. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she was 67 years old, though the deep lines on her face and the gray streaks in her dark hair made her look even older than her years. She wore a faded blue uniform that had been washed so many times the color had turned almost gray, and she kept her hair tucked beneath a worn headscarf that she had owned for more than 20 years. The students who attended Hartwell Academy came from wealthy families all over the world, and they paid thousands of dollars each semester to learn from the finest music teachers in the country. They walked through the grand hallways with their expensive instruments and their designer clothes, talking loudly about their upcoming recitals and the famous concert halls where they dreamed of performing one day. Not one of them ever looked at the cleaning lady who mopped the floors and emptied the trash cans and scrubbed the toilets in the bathrooms. To them, Elena Vasquez was invisible, just another member of the maintenance staff who existed only to keep the building clean and functioning. The teachers were no different in the way they treated her, and most of them had never even bothered to learn her name. Despite the fact that she had worked at the academy for almost 8 years, Professor Margaret Thornton, the director of the academy, was the worst of them all, and she would walk right past Elena as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. Sometimes Margaret would snap her fingers at Elena and point at a spot on the floor or a smudge on a window, never using words because words would require acknowledging that Elena was a human being worthy of conversation. Elena never complained about any of this treatment, and she never tried to make herself noticed or appreciated by the people around her. She simply did her work in silence, moving from room to room with her mop and her bucket and her cart full of cleaning supplies. The pay was not good, but it was enough to cover the rent on her tiny apartment and buy simple food from the grocery store down the street. She had no family to support and no expensive habits to maintain, so she needed very little money to survive. But there was one part of her job that Elena both loved and dreaded at the same time, and that was cleaning the main recital hall after everyone had gone home for the night. The recital hall was the heart of Hartwell Academy, a beautiful room with high ceilings and velvet curtains and perfect acoustics that made every note of music sound rich and full. In the center of the stage sat a magnificent Steinway grand piano, a 9-foot concert instrument that cost more than Elena would earn in 50 years of mopping floors. The piano was kept in perfect condition, tuned regularly by a specialist who flew in from New York City every month just to maintain this single instrument. When Elena cleaned the recital hall late at night, usually around midnight when the building was empty and silent, she would find herself drawn to that piano like a moth to a flame. She would stand at the edge of the stage, her mop forgotten in her hands, and stare at the gleaming black surface of the Steinway. Sometimes she would climb the steps to the stage and walk slowly toward the instrument, her worn shoes making soft sounds on the polished wood floor. She would stand beside the piano bench and look down at the keys, 88 of them in perfect order, white and black, waiting to be touched. Her hands would begin to tremble, and she would lift them slowly, holding them above the keys as if she were about to play, but she never did play. Not once in all the years she had worked at Hartwell Academy. She would stand there with her hands hovering over the keys, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 20, and then she would lower her hands and turn away and go back to her mopping. One night, about 3 years ago, the security guard named Thomas had found her standing at the piano like that. He had come into the recital hall on his midnight rounds and seen Elena on the stage, her hands raised above the keys, tears streaming down her weathered face. Thomas was a kind man in his 50s who had always treated Elena with respect, and he had watched her for a moment before clearing his throat to let her know he was there. Elena had turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was something Thomas would never forget. It was not embarrassment at being caught in a private moment, and it was not fear of getting in trouble for being near the expensive piano. It was grief, deep and endless grief, the kind of sorrow that comes from losing something so precious that life itself feels empty without it. Thomas had opened his mouth to ask if she was okay, but Elena had already walked past him and picked up her mop and left the recital hall without saying a word. He never mentioned that night to anyone, and he never asked Elena about what he had seen. But after that, he always made sure to delay his rounds a little bit so that Elena could have her time alone with the piano before he came through. Elena's hands were not like the hands of other cleaning ladies her age. Most women who spent decades doing manual labor had rough, strong hands with thick fingers and calluses from years of hard work. Elena's hands were different, and anyone who looked closely would notice that they were long and slender and graceful, despite her age, but they were also covered in scars, thin white lines that crisscrossed her fingers and palms and the backs of her hands. Like a map of old wounds, some of the scars were barely visible, faded by time, while others were still raised in pink as if the injuries had never fully healed. Elena always wore long sleeves, even in the summer, and she kept her hands hidden as much as possible when she was around other people. She did not want anyone to see the scars, and she did not want anyone to ask questions about how she had gotten them. Questions would require answers, and answers would require remembering, and remembering was something Elena had spent 30 years trying to avoid. So she kept her head down and her hands hidden and her mouth closed, and she let the world believe that she was nothing more than a simple cleaning woman with no past worth knowing and no future worth imagining. The students continued to ignore her, and the teachers continued to look through her, and Alina continued to mop the floors and empty the trash cans and stand alone in the recital hall at midnight, staring at a piano she would never play. That was the life of Alina Vasquez, invisible and forgotten, and she had made peace with it a long time ago, or at least she thought she had made peace with it, until the day Professor Margaret Thornton made an announcement that would change everything. The announcement came on a cold Tuesday morning in November, when Professor Margaret Thornton gathered the entire staff of Hartwell Academy in the main lecture hall for what she called an urgent meeting. Alina stood at the back of the room with the other maintenance workers, still holding him up because Margaret had not given them enough notice to put away their cleaning supplies. The lecture hall was filled with teachers and administrators and office staff, all of them wondering what could be so important that Margaret would interrupt the morning classes. Margaret Thornton was a tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair that she wore pulled back in a tight bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to judge everyone they looked upon. She had been the director of Hartwell Academy for 15 years, and she ran the institution like a queen ruling over her kingdom. She stood at the podium in the front of the lecture hall, wearing an expensive gray suit and a pearl necklace that probably cost more than Alina earned in 6 months. When everyone had settled down and stopped talking, Margaret cleared her throat and began to speak. In her crisp, commanding voice, she announced that the Academy would be hosting its annual charity gala in 6 weeks, on the Saturday before Christmas, and that this year the event would be bigger and more important than ever before. The gala was a tradition at Hartwell Academy, a night when wealthy donors and music lovers gathered to watch performances and write large checks to support the school. But this year, Margaret explained, the gala would have a special theme that she had personally designed to make the event more memorable and meaningful. The theme was called Hidden Talents, and the idea was to showcase unexpected musical abilities from people who were not professional performers. This meant that every member of the staff, not just the music teachers and students, would be required to participate in the gala by performing something on stage. The room erupted in nervous whispers and uncomfortable laughter as people realized what Margaret was asking them to do. Administrative assistants who had never played an instrument looked at each other with panic in their eyes. Accountants and office managers began calculating how they could possibly learn a musical piece in just 6 weeks, but Margaret raised her hand for silence and explained that the performances did not need to be difficult or impressive. The point was to show the donors that Hartwell, the Academy, was a community where everyone appreciated music, not just the talented few. She that said it would demonstrate institutional unity and prove that the love of music lived in every corner of the Academy. The teachers and administrators in the front rows nodded their heads and tried to look enthusiastic, even though many of them were terrified at the thought of performing in front of a crowd. Alina listened to all of this from her spot at the back of the room, and she felt her heart begin to beat faster with every word Margaret spoke. She told herself that surely the maintenance staff would be excused from this requirement, because what wealthy donor would want to watch a janitor stumble through a musical performance? But then Margaret looked directly at the back of the room where Alina and the other cleaning staff were standing, and she smiled a cold smile that made Alina feel sick to her stomach. Margaret said that she wanted to emphasize that every member of the staff meant exactly that. Every single person who worked at Hartwell Academy without exception. She said the maintenance workers would participate too, because it would show the donors that the Academy treated all of its employees as valued members of the community. The other maintenance workers groaned quietly, and Alina could feel the blood draining from her face as the reality of the situation became clear after the meeting ended. Alina tried to slip away and return to her work, hoping that if she stayed invisible enough, everyone would forget about her. But Margaret Thornton had other plans, and she caught Alina by the arm just as she was about to leave the lecture hall. Margaret looked down at Alina with that cold smile still on her face, and she asked in a voice sweet as poison what instrument Alina would be playing at the gala. Alina kept her eyes on the floor and said quietly that she did not play any instruments and that perhaps she could be excused from the performance. Margaret laughed, a sharp sound that had no warmth in it at all, and she said that was nonsense because everyone had some kind of talent hidden inside them. She said that even a cleaning lady must have learned something musical at some point in her life, even if it was just a simple song from childhood. Alina shook her head and said again that she really could not perform, that she had nothing to offer, that she would only embarrass the Academy in front of the important donors. But Margaret would not accept any excuses, and her smile grew even colder as she tightened her grip on Alina's arm. She announced that she had the perfect solution for Alina's situation, and that she would assign Alina to play a simple tune on the piano during the gala. Alina felt the world spin around her when she heard the word piano, and she had to grab the back of a chair to keep herself from falling. She opened her mouth to protest, to say that she could not possibly play the piano, but Margaret was already talking over her. Margaret explained that Alina would play something easy, something a child could learn, just a few notes to add a charming moment of humility to the evening. She said it would provide comic relief between the more serious performances, a light moment that would make the donors smile and feel good about the Academy's inclusive spirit. The words comic relief hit Alina like a slap across the face. and she understood exactly what Margaret was doing. Margaret wanted to put the cleaning lady on stage to be laughed at, to be the joke that made the wealthy donors feel superior and entertained. It was cruel and humiliating, and Margaret knew exactly what she was doing when she designed this plan. Some of the teachers who were still in the room heard what Margaret said, and a few of them snickered quietly behind their hands. One young professor whispered to another that it would be hilarious to watch the old janitor try to play the piano, and they both laughed without bothering to hide their amusement. Alina wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away and never come back to this place, where people treated her like a thing to be mocked and discarded, but she needed this job, needed the small paycheck that kept a roof over her head and food in her kitchen. She could not afford to lose her position at the academy, not at her age, not when she had no other skills that anyone wanted and no family to help her. If she became homeless, so Alina did the only thing she could do in that moment, and she lowered her head and said, yes, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Margaret smiled triumphantly and released Alina's arm and walked away to congratulate herself on her wonderful idea for the gala. Alina stood alone in the empty lecture hall, her hands trembling at her sides, feeling the scars on her fingers burn as if the old wounds had suddenly reopened. For 30 years she had hidden from the piano, had built walls around the memories that lived inside that instrument, had convinced herself that the past was dead and buried forever. And now this cruel woman was going to drag her back to the piano against her will, was going to force her to sit at that instrument and pretend to be something she was not. The other maintenance workers found Alina a few minutes later, still standing in the same spot with a look on her face they had never seen before. They patted her on the shoulder and told her not to worry. We said that Margaret was just a mean old woman who liked to make people suffer. One of them, a kind man named Roberto who had worked at the academy even longer than Alina, said he would try to help her learn something simple before the gala. Alina thanked them for their kindness, but inside she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was fear, deep and cold and paralyzing. But underneath the fear there was something else. Something she did not want to examine too closely. It was the faint echo of music, stirring in the depths of her heart after 30 years of silence, and Alina did not know whether to embrace it or run from it as fast as she could. The mandatory practice sessions began 1 week after Margaret Thornton's announcement, and Alina dreaded every single one of them with every fiber of her being. Margaret had assigned a young piano instructor named David Chen to help Alina learn a simple children's song before the gala. David was 29 years old, a talented pianist who had graduated from the Juilliard School and joined Hartwell Academy 3 years ago to teach beginning and intermediate students. He was handsome and confident and used to being admired by everyone around him, and he had never in his life been asked to teach a cleaning lady how to play the piano. When David first heard about his assignment, he complained loudly to the other teachers in the faculty lounge about how his talents were being wasted on such a ridiculous task. But Margaret had made it clear that everyone needed to contribute to making the gala a success, and David had no choice but to accept his role. The first practice session was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon in one of the small rehearsal rooms on the second floor of the academy. Alina arrived exactly on time, having finished her morning cleaning duties early so that she would not be late and give anyone another reason to criticize her. She knocked softly on the door of the rehearsal room and waited until David called out for her to enter. When she walked in, David was sitting at a small upright piano, looking at his phone with a bored expression on his face. He glanced up at Alina and sighed heavily, as if her very presence was a burden too great to bear. He gestured toward a chair beside the piano bench and told Alina to sit down so they could get started with this little project. His voice was slow and exaggerated, the way people sometimes talk to small children or to those they believe are not very intelligent. Alina sat down on the chair and folded her hands in her lap, keeping her scarred fingers hidden as best she could. David explained that they would be learning a very simple song called Mary Had a Little Lamb, which had only a few notes and should be easy enough for anyone to play. He played the melody once on the piano, his fingers moving quickly and carelessly over the keys as if the song was beneath his dignity. He told Alina to move to the piano. Ben should try to copy what he had just played. Alina stood slowly and walked to the piano, feeling her heart pound against her ribs like a bird trying to escape from a cage. She sat down on the bench and looked at the keys, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt and spin around her. These were not the keys of the magnificent Steinway in the recital hall, just a simple upright piano used for student practice. But they were still piano keys. Alina had not touched piano keys in 30 years, not since the night when everything she loved was taken from her in a single terrible moment. Her hands trembled as she lifted them toward the keyboard, and she had to force herself to breathe slowly and steadily. David watched her with impatience and told her to just press the keys. Said it was not that difficult. Said even a child could do this much. Alina pressed one key, then another, deliberately hitting the wrong notes and creating a sound that was clumsy and harsh. She fumbled through the simple melody, making mistakes that any beginner would make, playing as if she had never seen a piano before in her life. David sighed again and shook his head, clearly frustrated by what he saw as Alina's complete lack of musical ability. He demonstrated the melody again, this time playing each note separately and naming them out loud as if Alina did not know what notes were. Then he guided Alina through the song one note at a time, correcting her when she made mistakes and growing more impatient with each passing minute. Lena continued to play badly, hitting wrong keys and losing her place in the simple melody over and over again. She knew exactly what she was doing, knew that she was pretending to be worse than any true beginner would actually be, but she could not let anyone know the truth about her relationship with the piano. You could not reveal the secret she had kept hidden for 3 decades, so she played the role of the hopeless cleaning lady who had never touched an instrument, and she made David believe that teaching her was indeed a waste of his precious time. By the end of the first practice session, David was barely hiding his contempt for Alina and her apparent inability to learn. He told her they would meet again on Thursday, and he strongly suggested that she practice on her own. If she could find a piano somewhere, Alina nodded meekly and thanked him for his patience. Even though his patience had run out about 10 minutes into the lesson, she left the rehearsal room and walked down the hallway, passing groups of students who barely noticed her existence. When she reached the stairwell, she stopped and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes and letting out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her hands were shaking violently now, and she pressed them against her chest to try to make them stop. Playing badly on purpose had been harder than she expected, because every instinct in her body had wanted to let her fingers move the way they were trained to move. For a moment during the practice session, when David was not looking, Alina had almost let her hands play the melody correctly. The muscle memory was still there, buried deep beneath 30 years of silence, and it had taken all of her willpower to suppress it. I stood in the stairwell for a long time, waiting for her heart to slow down and her hands to stop trembling. Then she picked up her mop and her bucket and went back to work, pushing the experience to the back of her mind, where she kept all the things she did not want to think about. The practice sessions continued twice a week for the next 3 weeks, and each one was more painful than the last. David grew more and more frustrated with Alina's lack of progress, and he stopped trying to hide his contempt for her. He would roll his eyes when she made mistakes and mutter under his breath about how hopeless this whole situation was. Sometimes he would tell the other teachers about their sessions, making jokes about the cleaning lady who could not learn 3 simple notes. The other teachers would laugh and shake their heads, and Alina would hear their whispers when she walked past them in the hallways. Poor old thing, they would say, she really has no talent at all. What was Margaret thinking when she came up with this idea? Lena endured all of it without complaint, without defense, without any attempt to prove them wrong. She simply bowed her head and accepted their mockery, because accepting their mockery was easier than revealing the truth. But at night, when the academy was empty and silent, Alina would go to the recital hall and stand before the Steinway grand piano. She would not play. She never played, but she would stand there with her hands hovering over the keys and she would remember the sound of thousands of people applauding in concert halls around the world. She would remember the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, responding to her touch like an extension of her own soul. She would remember the music that used to flow through her like water through a river, natural and unstoppable and alive. And then she would remember the screech of tires and the crash of metal, and the screaming that seemed to go on forever. She would remember waking up in a hospital bed with bandages covering her hands, and a doctor telling her that her husband and daughter were gone. She would remember the 18 surgeries that tried to repair the damage to her fingers, and the final verdict that she would never play professionally again. The memories would wash over her like waves in a storm, and she would stand at the piano until the tears dried on her cheeks and the first light of dawn began to appear in the windows. Then she would wipe her face and pick up her mop and go back to being the invisible cleaning lady that everyone ignored. One night, about 2 weeks before the gala, the old security guard Thomas found Alina in the recital hall again. This time she was sitting on the piano bench, her hands flat on her thighs, staring at the keys with an expression of such profound sadness that Thomas felt his own heart break a little. He did not say anything, just stood in the doorway and waited until Alina noticed him. When she finally looked up and saw him there, she tried to smile, but the smile did not reach her. Thomas walked slowly toward the stage and climbed the steps and stood beside the piano, looking down at Alina with kindness in his weathered face. He said he had been watching her for years, had seen her come to this piano night after night, had wondered what sorrow she carried that made her cry in the darkness. Lena looked away, and said that some sorrows were too heavy to explain, too deep to share with anyone. Thomas nodded and said he understood, said everyone had their own burdens to carry through life. But then he said something that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. He said that whatever she was hiding, whatever secret she kept locked inside her heart, it would not stay hidden forever. He said the truth had a way of coming out eventually, whether we wanted it to or not. Then he tipped his hat to her and walked away, leaving Alina alone with the piano and the silence and the weight of 30 years of secrets. To understand who Alina Vasquez really was, one must travel back in time to the year 1958, to a small house in Madrid, Spain, where a baby girl was born on a warm September evening. Her name was Elena Marquez de Vidal, and from the very first moment she entered the world, There was something special about her. Her parents were simple people, her father a carpenter and her mother a seamstress, but they loved music more than almost anything else in life. They would play records on an old phonograph every evening after dinner, filling their tiny home with the sounds of Beethoven and Mozart and Chopin. Little Alina would sit in her mother's lap and listen to the music with her eyes wide open, as if she could see the notes floating through the air around her. When Alina was 3 years old, her parents scraped together enough money to buy an old used piano from a neighbor who was moving away. They put the piano in the corner of the living room, and Alina immediately climbed onto the bench and began pressing the keys with her tiny fingers. Her parents laughed and assumed she was just playing the way all children play, making noise for the simple joy of making noise. But then something remarkable happened that changed everything. Alina began to pick out melodies on the piano, simple tunes she had heard on the phonograph, reproducing them note by note with perfect accuracy. Her parents could not believe what they were hearing, could not understand how a 3-year-old child could play music she had only listened to, never studied. They called a neighbor who taught music at the local school, and he came to their house to see this miracle child for himself. When he heard Alina play, his face went pale and he had to sit down because his legs would not support him. He told Alina's parents that their daughter had a gift that came along, perhaps once in a generation, maybe once in a century. He said she had what musicians call perfect pitch, the ability to hear a note and know exactly what it was without any reference point. But more than that, she had an instinctive understanding of music that could not be taught, only nurtured and developed. From that day forward, Alina's life was dedicated to the piano, and she progressed faster than anyone could have imagined possible. By the age of 5, she was playing pieces that most students did not attempt until they were teenagers. By the age of 7, she gave her first public concert at a small theater in Madrid, and the audience was so amazed that they gave her a standing ovation that lasted for 10 minutes. Word of the child prodigy spread throughout Spain, and soon Alina was invited to perform in Barcelona, in Seville, in Valencia. In every major city in the country, music critics wrote articles about her, calling her a gift from heaven, a treasure that Spain had been blessed to receive. Her parents gave up their own careers to manage her schedule, traveling with her from concert to concert and making sure she continued her education between performances. Alina loved the piano with all her heart, loved the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, loved the way music could express things that words could never capture. She practiced for hours every day, not because anyone forced her to, but because she could not imagine doing anything else with her time. By the time Alina was 18, she had been accepted to the Royal Conservatory of Madrid, the most prestigious music school in Spain. She studied there for 4 years, mastering the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire and developing her own unique style of playing. Her teachers said she had fire in her soul, that when she played the piano, she did not just perform the music, she became the music. At 22, Alina entered her first international competition, the International Chopin competition in Warsaw, Poland, one of the most respected piano competitions in the world. She was the youngest competitor that year, and many people did not expect her to make it past the first round. But Alina played Chopin's Ballade No. 4 in F minor with such passion and technical perfection that the judges were left speechless. She won the gold medal, the first Spanish pianist to win the Chopin competition in more than 40 years. The victory launched her international career, and suddenly Alina was being invited to perform at the greatest concert halls in the world. She played at the Royal Albert Hall in London, at the Vienna Musikverein, at the Sydney Opera House, at La Scala in Milan, and then, at the age of 25, she received the invitation that every pianist dreams of receiving. She was asked to perform at Carnegie Hall in New York City, the most famous concert venue in the United States. Alina flew to New York with her parents by her side, her heart full of excitement and her fingers ready to show the world what Spanish fire could do. The night of the concert, Carnegie Hall was packed with nearly 3,000 people, including music critics from every major newspaper in America. Alina walked onto the stage in a red dress that matched the passion in her heart, and she sat down at the Steinway grand piano without saying a word. She played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece so technically demanding that many pianists spent years preparing to perform it. Alina played it as if she had been born with the music already inside her, as if the notes were not something she had learned but something she had always known. When she finished, the audience sat in stunned silence for a long moment, as if they could not believe what they had just witnessed. Then the applause began, a thunder of clapping and cheering that shook the walls of the historic hall. People rose to their feet, tears streaming down their faces, calling out her name and begging for an encore. The New York Times Review the next day gave her a headline that would follow her for the rest of her career. They called her the Spanish Flame, and they wrote that watching her play was like watching fire itself dance across the piano keys. In the years that followed, Alina won every major piano competition in the world, including the Van Cliburn competition in Texas, which she won at the age of 28. She recorded dozens of albums, gave hundreds of concerts, and became one of the most celebrated pianists of her generation. And then, at the age of 30, Alina fell in love. His name was Antonio Vasquez, and he was a conductor from Argentina who was making his own name in the classical music world. They met at a music festival in Salzburg, Austria, where Alina was performing and Antonio was conducting the orchestra. From the first moment their eyes met across the rehearsal room, they both knew that their lives would never be the same. Antonio was tall and handsome with dark eyes and a warm smile that made Elena feel safe and loved in a way she had never felt before. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony in Madrid, surrounded by family and friends and the music that had brought them together. 2 years after the wedding, Elena gave birth to a daughter they named Isabella, and Elena discovered that there was something she loved even more than music. Isabella was a beautiful child with her mother's dark hair and her father's gentle eyes, and she filled their home with laughter and joy. Elena continued to perform, but she reduced her concert schedule so she could spend more time with her daughter. She would play piano at home while Isabella danced around the living room, spinning and twirling to the music her mother created. Those were the happiest years of Elena's life. Years filled with love and music and the pure joy of watching her daughter grow. But happiness, as Elena would soon learn, was a fragile thing that could be shattered in an instant. It happened on a rainy night in November of 1992. When Elena was 34 years old, the family was driving home from a concert in Barcelona. Antonio at the wheel, Isabella sleeping in the back seat, Elena sitting beside her husband and talking about their plans for Christmas. They did not see the truck that ran the red light until it was too late. Elena remembered the screech of tires, the blinding lights, the terrible sound of metal crushing against metal, and then there was only darkness. When she woke up in the hospital 3 days later, a doctor stood beside her bed with tears in his eyes. He told her that Antonio had died at the scene, that Isabella had died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Elena screamed and screamed until they gave her something to make her sleep, and even then she screamed in her nightmares. Her hands had been crushed in the accident, trapped in the wreckage for 2 hours before rescue workers could free her. Over the next 2 years, she endured 18 surgeries to repair the damage to her fingers. The doctors did their best, but in the end they told her what she already knew in her heart. She would never play professionally again. The Spanish flame had been extinguished, and all that remained was ash and sorrow and the echoing memory of music that would never return. With only 3 weeks remaining before the charity gala, the mockery of Elena grew worse with each passing day. Word had spread throughout Hartwell Academy about the cleaning lady who could not learn a simple children's song, and it seemed like everyone found this endlessly amusing. Students would whisper and giggle when Elena walked past them in the hallways, and some of the bolder ones would hum "Mary Had a Little Lamb" in exaggerated off-key voices. One morning, Elena arrived at work to find a small toy piano sitting in her supply closet, placed there by someone who thought they were being clever. A note was attached to it that said "for practice" in handwriting that Elena did not recognize. She stood looking at the toy piano for a long time, feeling something cold settle in her chest. Then she picked it up and threw it in the trash and went about her day as if nothing had happened. David Chen continued their practice sessions, but his patience had completely disappeared and he no longer even tried to hide his contempt for Elena. He would check his phone constantly during their lessons, barely paying attention as Elena struggled through the simple melody. Sometimes he would not even bother to correct her mistakes, just wave his hand dismissively and tell her to try again. One afternoon, Professor Margaret Thornton stopped by the rehearsal room to check on their progress. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest, watching Elena fumble through the song with a smile of pure satisfaction on her face. When Elena hit a particularly wrong note, Margaret laughed out loud and said to David that this was going to be even more entertaining than she had imagined. Elena kept her eyes on the piano keys and did not respond, but her hands trembled so badly that she had to stop playing entirely. Margaret walked over to the piano and looked down at Elena with those cold blue eyes. She said she hoped Elena appreciated the opportunity she was being given, the chance to perform at such a prestigious event in front of such important people. Her voice dripped with false kindness, the way a cat might purr before it pounced on a mouse. Elena nodded and said yes. She was very grateful for the opportunity, her voice flat and empty of any emotion. Margaret patted Elena on the shoulder in a way that was meant to seem supportive but felt more like a warning. Then she swept out of the room, leaving behind the faint smell of expensive perfume and the heavy weight of humiliation. David waited until Margaret was gone before letting out a long sigh and running his hands through his hair, and with frustration he told Elena that he did not know how he was going to make her ready for the gala, said that she seemed to be getting worse instead of better. Elena apologized quietly and said she would try harder, knowing full well that she was not trying at all. After the practice session ended, Elena walked through the hallways of the academy with her head down, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She passed the main recital hall where Professor Thornton was rehearsing her own piece for the gala, a complicated Debussy composition that showcased her technical skill. Margaret played with the door open, and Elena knew this was not an accident. Every time Elena walked by, Margaret would play louder and more dramatically, as if to emphasize the vast gulf between a real pianist and a pathetic cleaning lady. The other teachers had begun preparing their own performances as well, and the academy was filled with the sounds of music from morning until night. The administrative staff practiced simple songs on various instruments, nervous but determined to do their best. Even the other maintenance workers had found ways to participate without too much embarrassment. Roberta was going to play the harmonica, a skill he had learned as a child in Mexico. Maria from the cafeteria was going to sing a traditional song from her home country of the Philippines, but Elena was the only one being set up for public humiliation. The only one assigned a task designed to make her look foolish. She understood now that this had been Margaret's plan all along, to create a moment of cruel comedy at the expense of the invisible cleaning woman. The thought made Elena feel sick to her stomach, but she did not know how to escape the trap that had been set for her one evening after her shift. Elena was walking to the bus stop when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see David Chen hurrying to catch up with her. His face flushed with anger. He stopped in front of her and said he needed to talk to her about the gala, said he was tired of wasting his time on a hopeless student. His voice was loud and sharp, and people on the sidewalk turned to look at them. David said he did not understand how anyone could be so bad at something so simple. Who said he had taught children younger than 10 who learned faster than Elena. He asked her if she was even trying, or if she was deliberately making him look bad in front of the other faculty members. Elena stood very still, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on a spot on the ground. She said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would make any difference. David's frustration boiled over, and he threw his hands up in the air. He shouted that it was just a simple melody, that any human being with working fingers should be able to play it after weeks of practice. How can anyone be this bad at music? He demanded, his voice echoing off the buildings around them. Elena finally looked up at him, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. It was not anger and it was not sadness, but something deeper and older. Something that made David take a step backward without knowing why. Then the moment passed, and Elena's eyes were empty again, and she apologized quietly for being such a poor student. She turned and walked away toward the bus stop, leaving David standing on the sidewalk feeling strangely unsettled. That night at the academy, a retired professor named Harold Mills was working late in the library, surrounded by old books and papers. Harold was 82 years old, a former music critic who had spent his career traveling the world and writing about the greatest pianists of his generation. He had retired from active criticism 20 years ago, but still taught a history of music class at the academy once a week. Harold had noticed Elena many times over the years, had always been puzzled by something familiar about her that he could not quite identify. Unlike the other teachers, he always said good morning to her when he passed her in the hallways, always treated her with the basic respect that every human being deserved. Something about David's outburst that afternoon had been bothering Harold, and he could not stop thinking about it. He had been in the faculty lounge when David came storming in, complaining about the incompetent cleaning lady who could not learn 3 notes. The other teachers had laughed and made jokes, but Harold had stayed silent, troubled by a feeling he could not explain now. Sitting alone in the library, surrounded by the memories of 50 years in the music world, Harold found himself pulling out old programs and concert reviews. He was not sure what he was looking for, only that something was nagging at the back of his mind, something he needed to find. He searched through boxes of old documents, programs from concerts he had attended decades ago, photographs of performers he had reviewed in his younger days, and then, in a box he had not opened in more than 30 years, he found what he did not know he was looking for. It was a program from Carnegie Hall, dated 1980, with a photograph on the cover of a young woman in a red dress. The woman was sitting at a piano, her hands poised above the keys, her dark eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to leap off the page. Harold stared at the photograph for a long time, his heart beating faster and faster. As recognition slowly dawned, he looked at the name printed beneath the photograph, looked at the eyes in the picture, and thought about the eyes of the cleaning lady who mopped the floors of Hartwell Academy. His hands began to shake as he opened the program and read the review he himself had written nearly 4 years ago. He read the words he had typed on his old typewriter, words that described a once-in-a-generation talent, a pianist who did not just play music but became it. And Harold Mills finally understood what had been nagging at him all these years, finally recognized the ghosts that walked the hallways of the academy. The cleaning lady with the scarred hands and the empty eyes was Elena Marquez de Vidal, the legendary Spanish flame who had disappeared from the world 30 years ago. Harold sat alone in the library, holding the old program in his trembling hands, wondering what terrible thing had happened to bring such a great artist to such a lowly place. Harold Mills did not sleep at all that night after his discovery in the library. He sat in the small apartment he kept near the academy, surrounded by more boxes of old programs and reviews, his mind racing with memories from decades past. The Carnegie Hall program lay open on his coffee table, the photograph of young Elena Marquez de Vidal staring up at him with those fierce dark eyes. Harold had been 43 years old in 1980s. At the height of his career as one of the most respected music critics in America, he had reviewed hundreds of pianists in his lifetime, had watched countless performers come and go, most of them talented but ultimately forgettable. But Elena Marquez de Vidal had been different from the first note she played that night at Carnegie Hall. Harold closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him like waves returning to shore after a long absence. He remembered sitting in the 4th row of Carnegie Hall, his notebook open on his knee, his pen ready to record his observations. He remembered the hush that fell over the audience when the young woman in the red dress walked onto the stage. She was only 29 years old, already famous in Europe but relatively unknown in America. And many in the audience did not know what to expect, but Harold had heard recordings of her work and had read the European reviews, and he knew he was about to witness something extraordinary. Alina had sat down at the piano without any grand gestures or theatrical flourishes. She had simply placed her hands on the keys and begun to play, and within the first minute, Harold had forgotten how to breathe. The music that poured from the piano was unlike anything he had heard before, or would hear again in his long career. It was not just technically perfect, though it was certainly that. Every note precise and clear and exactly where it needed to be, was alive, pulsing with emotion and meaning, as if the piano itself had awakened and was speaking directly to each person in the audience. Harold had written in his review that watching Alina play was like watching fire dance, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to look away from. He had called her the Spanish Flame, a nickname that would follow her for the rest of her performing career. After the concert, Harold had waited backstage with the other critics, hoping to meet the young pianist and tell her how deeply her performance had moved him. When Alina had finally emerged from her dressing room, she had been gracious and humble, accepting compliments with a shy smile that, it seemed, at odds with the fierce passion she displayed on stage. Harold had shaken her hand and told her that he had been listening to piano music for 30 years and had never heard anything quite like what she had played that night. Alina had thanked him sincerely, and he had noticed even then that her hands were remarkable, long and slender and graceful, for the hands of someone born to play the piano. Those hands, Harold thought now. Staring at the photograph in the dim light of his apartment, he thought about the hands of the cleaning lady at Hartwell Academy, covered in scars, hidden beneath long sleeves, trembling whenever she sat at the piano. The same hands, damaged and broken but still recognizable to someone who knew what to look for. Harold stayed awake until dawn, reading through old articles and reviews, piecing together the story of what had happened to Alina Marquez de Vidal. He found the news reports from 1990, the stories about the terrible car accident that had killed her husband and daughter. He read about the months she had spent in the hospital, the surgeries that had tried to repair her damaged hands, the final verdict that her concert career was over. And then, after 1994, there was nothing. Alina Marquez de Vidal had simply disappeared from the public eye, and no one seemed to know what had become of her. Some articles speculated that she had returned to Spain to live with her elderly parents. Others suggested she had retreated to some private location to grieve in solitude, but no one knew for certain. And eventually the world had moved on and forgotten about the brilliant pianist whose flame had been so cruelly extinguished until now, Harold thought, until a retired old music critic recognized those eyes in the face of a cleaning woman. The next morning, Harold arrived at the academy earlier than usual, determined to speak with Alina before her shift began. He found her in the supply closet on the first floor, gathering her cleaning supplies for the day, her gray hair tucked beneath the same worn headscarf she always wore. Harold stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, seeing her now with new eyes, seeing the ghost of the great artist hidden beneath a humble exterior. Alina turned and saw him standing there, and something flickered across her face, something like fear mixed with resignation. She greeted him politely, the way she greeted everyone who bothered to acknowledge her existence, and asked if there was something she could help him with. Harold stepped into the supply closet and closed the door behind him, his heart pounding with the weight of what he was about to say. He looked into her eyes, those dark eyes that had once burned with such fierce passion, and he said the words that had been building inside him all night. "I know who you are," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the small space. Alina's face did not change, but her body went very still, like a deer that has just sensed a predator nearby. She asked him what he meant, her voice carefully neutral. Giving nothing away, Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the Carnegie Hall program from 1987, held it up so Alina could see the photograph on the cover. The young woman in the red dress with the fierce dark eyes. Alina looked at the photograph for a long moment, and Harold watched as the mask she had worn for so many years began to crack. Her hands started to tremble, and she reached out to steady herself against the shelf of cleaning supplies. She did not speak, but her eyes filled with tears that she tried desperately to blink away. Harold told her that he had been at that concert, that he had been the one who gave her the nickname the Spanish Flame. He said he had reviewed hundreds of pianists in his career, but he had never forgotten her, had never heard anyone play with such passionate brilliance. Alina finally spoke, her voice cracked and raw, barely above a whisper. She said that woman died 30 years ago, that there was nothing left of her but memories and scars. She begged Harold to leave her alone, to let the past stay buried where it belonged, to let Alina Marquez de Vidal remain dead and forgotten. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "let her stay dead." Harold felt his own eyes fill with tears as he looked at this broken woman, this shell of the great artist he had once admired so deeply. He wanted to argue with her, wanted to tell her that talent like hers could never truly die, that the music was still inside her waiting to be released, but he saw the depth of her pain. You saw the 30 years of grief and loss written on her face, and he understood that this was not a decision he could make for her. He nodded slowly and put the program back in his pocket, respecting her wish to remain hidden. But before he left, he said one more thing that Alina would carry with her in the days to come. He said that the Alina he saw at Carnegie Hall did not play for critics or competitions or fame. She played because the music was inside her, with demanding to be released, Refusing to stay silent, he asked her if that music was still there, still waiting, still demanding to be heard. Then he opened the door and walked away, leaving Elena alone in the supply closet with her mop and her bucket and her tears. Elena stood there for a long time after he left, her hand pressed against her chest, feeling the echo of something she had thought was gone forever. The music, she thought, is it still there? She did not know the answer, and she was not sure she wanted to find out. The night before the charity gala, Elena sat alone in her tiny apartment, staring at the wall without really seeing it. The apartment was small and plain, just one room with a bed in one corner and a kitchen area in another. But it was clean and quiet, and it was hers. There were no photographs on the walls, no decorations of any kind, nothing that suggested a life lived before she moved here 8 years ago. Elena had made sure of that, had deliberately erased every trace of her previous existence when she created her new identity. The only thing she had kept from her old life was a small wooden box that sat at the bottom of her closet, buried beneath old clothes and forgotten shoes. She had not opened that box in many years, but tonight, the night before, she would be forced to sit at a piano in front of hundreds of people. She felt drawn to it. Elena walked to the closet and knelt down on the cold floor, pushing aside the clothes until her fingers touched the smooth wood of the box. She pulled it out and held it in her lap, feeling the weight of memories pressing against the lid. Her hands trembled as she opened the box, and she had to take several deep breaths before she could look inside. There were only a few items, carefully preserved, each one a piece of the life she had lost 30 years ago. A photograph of Antonio on their wedding day, his smile so wide and genuine that looking at it still made Elena's heart ache. A tiny pair of ballet shoes that had belonged to Isabella, worn soft from hours of dancing around the living room. A review from a Spanish newspaper, yellowed with age, praising Elena's performance at the Royal Conservatory when she was just 20 years old. And at the very bottom of the box, a piece of paper covered in musical notes, a short composition that Isabella had created when she was only 4 years old. Elena lifted the paper carefully, as if it might crumble to dust in her damaged hands. Isabella had called it Mama's Song, and she had spent hours working on it, her small face scrunched up in concentration as she figured out which notes sounded right together. It was a simple melody, just a few measures long, but it was the most precious piece of music Elena had ever possessed. She had not been able to play it since the accident, had not been able to even look at it without feeling like her heart was being torn from her chest. But tonight she held it up to the light and read the notes, hearing the melody in her mind as clearly as if Isabella were sitting beside her, playing it on their old piano in Madrid. Tears streamed down Elena's face, and she did not try to stop them. She allowed herself to grieve, really grieve, for the first time in many years, letting the pain wash over her like a wave that had been held back too long. She cried for Antonio, who had loved her with such devotion and gentleness. She cried for Isabella, who had never gotten the chance to grow up and become the beautiful woman Elena knew she would have been. And she cried for herself, for the pianist she had been, for the music that had once flowed through her like blood through veins. When the tears finally stopped, Elena felt something shift inside her, like a door opening in a room that had been locked for decades. A knock at her apartment door startled her, and she quickly wiped her face and closed the box. She was not expecting anyone, had never had a visitor in all the years she had lived in this building. When she opened the door, she found Professor Harold Mills standing in the hallway, his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable but determined. Elena started to close the door, but Harold asked her to please listen to him, just for a few minutes. Something in his voice made her step back and let him enter, though every instinct told her to send him away. Harold looked around the bare apartment, at the empty walls and the simple furniture, and his eyes filled with sadness. He told Elena that he had not been able to stop thinking about her since their conversation in the supply closet. He said he understood why she had hidden herself away, who understood the grief that had driven her to erase her own identity. But he could not accept that such extraordinary talent should be wasted, could not bear to watch her humiliate herself at the gala tomorrow night. Elena shook her head and told him there was nothing to save, that her hands were ruined, that she could never play the way she once did. She held up her scarred hands and showed him the damage, the crooked fingers that no longer moved with the speed and precision they once had. Even if I wanted to play, she said, these hands would not let me. Harold listened patiently, and when she finished, he asked her a simple question. He asked her if the problem was really her hands, or if it was something else entirely. Elena did not answer, because she knew what he was really asking. He was asking if she was afraid of the music itself, afraid of what it would feel like to play again, afraid of the memories that would come flooding back. The music reminds me of everything I lost, Elena finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Every note I ever played. Antonio was there listening, and Isabella was there dancing. If I play again, I will feel them, and I do not know if I can survive that. Harold nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. He told her that he had lost his wife 15 years ago, that he knew something about the kind of grief that never fully goes away, but he had learned that running from the memories did not make them hurt any less. The only way through grief, he said, was to walk straight into it, to let it wash over you and trust that you would still be standing when it passed. Elena turned away from him and walked to the window, looking out at the dark city below. She told him that she had built a new life here, a quiet life where no one knew who she used to be. That life might not be much, but it was safe, and safety was the only thing she had wanted for 30 years. Harold joined her at the window and stood beside her in silence. For a long moment then he said something that Alina would remember for the rest of her life. He said that the Alina he saw at Carnegie Hall did not play for fame or money or applause. She played because the music was a part of her, as essential as breathing, as natural as her heartbeat. Is it still there? He asked her. Is the music still inside you? Demanding to be released, Alina closed her eyes and searched inside herself for the answer to his question, and there, buried beneath 30 years of grief and silence, she found it. The music was still there, still alive, still waiting. It had never left her, had only been sleeping, and now it was beginning to wake up. I do not know if I can do this, Alina whispered, her voice shaking with fear and something else, something that might have been hope. Harold put a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her that she did not have to decide anything tonight. He said he would respect whatever choice she made, would keep her secret forever if that was what she wanted, but he left her with one final thought as he walked to the door. He said that Isabella had loved to dance while Alina played, that the music had brought joy to her daughter in a way nothing else could. Maybe, he said quietly, playing again would not be a betrayal of Isabella's memory. Maybe it would be a way of honoring it. Then he was gone, and Alina was alone again in her empty apartment. She sat on her bed and looked at the small wooden box that held all that remained of her previous life. She took out the piece of paper with Isabella's a song written on it and held it close to her heart. And in the quiet darkness of the night before the gala, Alina Marquez de Vidal made a decision. She did not know yet what she would play tomorrow night, did not know if her damaged hands would even remember how to make music, but she knew that Harold was right about one thing. The music was still inside her, and after 30 years of silence, it was demanding to be heard. The Saturday of the charity gala arrived with a cold wind and gray skies that seemed to match the anxiety churning in Elena's stomach. She woke up before dawn after barely sleeping at all, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Part of her wanted to call in sick, to hide in her apartment and pretend the gala was not happening, but she knew that would only delay the inevitable. And besides, she had never been a coward, even in her darkest moments. So Alina got out of bed and took a shower and put on the only nice dress she owned, a simple black dress she had bought at a second-hand store years ago. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her bathroom sink and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The woman in the mirror was old and tired, with gray hair and deep lines around her eyes, and hands covered in scars. She looked nothing like the young pianist in the red dress who had once set Carnegie Hall on fire with her passionate playing. Alina turned away from the mirror and gathered her courage and walked out the door. The gala was scheduled to begin at 7 o'clock in the evening, but the staff were required to arrive early to help with final preparations. Alina spent the afternoon helping to set up chairs in the recital hall, arranging flowers on tables, and making sure everything was spotlessly clean. Other maintenance workers moved around her with nervous energy, all of them dreading their own performances. Later that evening, Roberto kept practicing his harmonica in the corner, running through the same song over and over until Maria told him he was driving everyone crazy. Only Alina remained silent, going about her work with a calm that surprised even herself. The truth was that she had stopped being nervous somewhere around noon, when she realized that the worst had already happened to her 30 years ago. Or whatever embarrassment she might face tonight was nothing compared to the loss of her husband and daughter and career. That thought gave her a strange kind of peace, and she held on to it as the hours passed by. At 6:30, the recital hall had been transformed into a glittering showcase of wealth and elegance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting warm light on the rows of velvet-covered chairs. Huge flower arrangements decorated the stage, and the Steinway grand piano had been polished until it gleamed like black glass. The wealthy donors began arriving in expensive cars, wearing designer gowns and tailored suits, dripping with jewelry that cost more than Alina would earn in a lifetime. They moved through the hall like royalty, greeting each other with air kisses and practiced smiles, barely noticing the staff who had worked all day to create this perfect setting. Professor Margaret Thornton stood at the entrance, welcoming the most important guests personally and accepting their compliments on the beautiful event. She wore a silver gown that probably cost thousands of dollars, and her hair had been styled at an expensive salon. That morning when she saw Alina standing near the back of the hall, Margaret's smile turned sharp and satisfied. She walked over to Alina and looked her up and down, taking in the simple black dress and the worn shoes and the nervous hands clasped in front of her body. Margaret said she hoped Alina was ready for her big moment. Her voice dripping with false sweetness, she reminded Alina that her performance would come right after intermission, providing a charming moment of levity before the more serious pieces resumed. Alina nodded and said she understood, keeping her voice neutral and her face expressionless, patted her on the shoulder in that condescending the way she had, and swept away to greet Mordaunt. Gala began promptly at 7 with a welcome speech from the chairman of the Academy's board of directors. He talked about the importance of music education and the vital role that donations played in keeping the Academy running. Then the performances began, and Alina watched from the back of the hall as teachers and students took the stage one after another. A history professor played a surprisingly good violin solo that earned warm applause from the audience. A young student performed a complicated Beethoven sonata with the confidence of someone twice her age. Administrative staff did their best with simple songs and instruments, earning polite applause and sympathetic smiles from the donors. David Chen performed a dazzling Liszt composition that showcased his technical skill, and Alina watched his fingers fly across the keys with an expression no one could read. Professor Margaret Thornton took the stage just before intermission to perform her Debussy piece. She played competently, though without any particular passion or originality, and the audience applauded warmly because she was the director and they were expected to at intermission. The donors filed out to the lobby where champagne and hors d'oeuvres were being served. Lena remained in the recital hall, standing near the back wall, her eyes fixed on the Steinway piano on the stage. She had not touched a piano since her last practice session with David, had not allowed herself to even think about what she might do when her turn came. But now, looking at that beautiful instrument gleaming under the lights, she felt something stirring in her chest. It was the music, awakening after 30 years of sleep, demanding to be heard. The intermission lasted 30 minutes, and then the donors returned to their seats, chattering about the performances they had seen and wondering what was coming next. The master of ceremonies, a cheerful young man with perfect teeth, walked to the center of the stage and picked up his microphone. He announced that the second half of the evening would begin with a very special performance. He said it was a charming moment of humility that demonstrated the Academy's commitment to including all members of its community. And now, he said with a smile that did not quite hide his amusement, please welcome Alina from our custodial staff to play a simple tune. Scattered laughter rippled through the audience as people nudged each other and whispered behind their hands. They knew what was coming, had heard the rumors about the cleaning lady who could not learn a simple children's song. This was going to be the comic relief of the evening, a moment to laugh at someone less fortunate before returning to the serious music. Alina walked slowly down the center aisle toward the stage, feeling hundreds of eyes on her. Hearing the whispers and giggles that followed her every step, she climbed the stairs to the stage, her worn shoes making soft sounds on the polished wood. The lights were bright and hot, and she could barely see the audience beyond the first few rows. In the piano, someone had placed the sheet music for Mary Had a Little Lamb, the simple song she had been practicing for weeks. Alina stood beside the piano and looked at the sheet music for a long moment. The audience waited, some of them already smiling in anticipation of the awkward, fumbling performance they expected to see. Then Alina did something that no one in that room could have predicted. She reached out and picked up the sheet music and set it aside, placing it face down on top of the piano where she could not see it. A murmur of confusion ran through the audience, and people looked at each other with puzzled expressions. Anne Margaret Thornton, sitting in the front row in her silver gown, leaned forward with a frown on her face. Alina sat down on the piano bench and adjusted her position, her scarred hands resting on her thighs. She looked out at the audience, at all those wealthy, privileged faces watching her with curiosity and condescension, and then she looked down at the keys of the Steinway grand piano, 88 keys waiting to be touched, waiting to make music. Something in her posture changed, something in the way she held her shoulders and lifted her chin. The whispering in the audience stopped, because suddenly the woman on the stage did not look like a cleaning lady anymore. She looked like someone else entirely, someone with fire in her eyes and music in her soul. Alina lifted her hands and placed them on the keys, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her damaged fingers. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes and thought of Antonio smiling at her from across a rehearsal room in Salzburg. She thought of Isabella dancing in circles while music filled their home in Madrid. And then Alina began to play. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 rang out through the recital hall, and the world seemed to stop. It was the same piece Alina had played the night she won the Van Cliburn competition, the same piece that had made audiences weep and critics run out of words to describe her genius for 30 years. Those notes had lived only in her memory, locked away behind walls of grief and loss and silence, but now they poured from her fingers like water breaking through a dam, unstoppable and powerful and achingly beautiful. The audience froze in their seats, their champagne-softened smiles fading into expressions of shock and disbelief. This was not what they had come to see, not the fumbling, embarrassing performance of a cleaning lady struggling through a children's song. This was something else entirely, something that defied explanation, something that made no sense at all. In the front row, Professor Margaret Thornton's face went white as paper, her mouth hanging open in a way that would have been comical under any other circumstances. She looked around at the other faculty members, searching for someone to tell her this was some kind of joke, but they were all staring at the stage with the same stunned expressions. David Chen sat rigid in his chair, his jaw dropping lower and lower as Elena's fingers danced across the keys. This was the woman he had mocked and dismissed, the incompetent student he had complained about to anyone who would listen, and she was playing rock, one of the most technically demanding composers in the entire piano repertoire, with a passion and skill that made his own performance look like a student recital. The music filled the hall like a living thing, wrapping around the audience and pulling them into its embrace. Elena's technique was not perfect, not anymore, not after 30 years without practice and 18 surgeries on her damaged hands. There were moments when she had to adapt a passage, had to find a different way to play a phrase because her fingers would not move the way they once did. But what she lacked in technical precision, she more than made up for in raw emotional power. Every note carried the weight of her grief, the depth of her love, the fire that had earned her the name, the Spanish Flame, all those years ago. Tears began to stream down Elena's face as she played, but she did not stop, did not falter, did not let the emotion overwhelm her music. She played for Antonio, for the husband who had believed in her talent and supported her dreams and loved her with his whole heart. She played for Isabella, for the daughter who had danced to her music and composed little songs and called her mama with such joy in her voice. She played for the young woman she had been, the prodigy from Madrid who had conquered the greatest concert halls in the world. And she played for herself, for the broken woman who had hidden in shadows for 3 decades, afraid to touch the instrument that had once been her greatest love. The music rose and fell like waves on the ocean, sometimes gentle and tender, sometimes fierce and overwhelming. Time seemed to lose all meaning as Elena played, and no one in the audience moved or spoke or even seemed to breathe in the back of the hall. Old Professor Harold Mills stood with tears running down his weathered cheeks. He had hoped for this, had prayed for it, but he had never truly believed he would see the Spanish Flame rise from the ashes of her grief. Yet here she was, playing with the same fire that had captivated him at Carnegie Hall nearly 40 years ago. The piece lasted for 12 uninterrupted minutes. 12 minutes that changed everything for everyone who witnessed them. Elena played the final notes with her eyes closed, letting the music fade into silence like a prayer ascending to heaven. For a long moment after she finished, there was absolute silence in the recital hall. No one moved, no one spoke. No one seemed to know what to do with what they had just witnessed. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, a single person rose to their feet. It was an elderly woman in an expensive gown, someone who had probably attended hundreds of concerts in her lifetime. She stood and began to clap. Slowly at first, then faster and louder, her face wet with tears. Another person stood, and then another, and then the entire audience was on their feet. The applause erupted like thunder, filling the hall with a sound that shook the crystal chandeliers overhead. People were crying, openly weeping, not caring that their expensive makeup was ruined or their dignified composure was gone. They clapped and cheered, and called out Elena's name, though most of them did not yet know who she really was. The standing ovation lasted for 7 minutes, and every time it seemed to be dying down, someone would shout or whistle and it would surge again. Elena sat at the piano through all of it, her hands folded in her lap, tears still streaming down her face. She had not expected this, had not allowed herself to imagine that her broken fingers could still make music that moved people for 30 years. She had believed that the best part of her had died in that car accident with Antonio and Isabella, but now, surrounded by the thunder of applause and the sight of strangers weeping for her music, she understood that she had been wrong. The music had never died, who had only been waiting, patient and faithful, for her to find the courage to let it out again. Professor Margaret Thornton remained seated in the front row, her face a mask of shock and humiliation. She had designed this moment to mock and embarrass the cleaning lady, to provide comic relief at the expense of someone she considered beneath her. Instead, she had accidentally given a stage to one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century. The irony was not lost on the other faculty members, who were looking at Margaret with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed satisfaction. David Chen had not moved from his seat, could not seem to make his body respond to any commands from his brain. He was replaying every dismissive comment he had ever made about Elena, every eye roll, every complaint, every cruel joke. He had treated a living legend like she was worthless, had talked down to her like she was stupid, had mocked her to her face and behind her back. The shame he felt in that moment was so intense he thought he might be sick when the applause finally began to fade. Elena stood slowly from the piano bench. Her legs were shaken, and she had to grip the edge of the piano to steady herself. She looked out at the audience, at all those tear-stained faces looking back at her with awe and wonder. Then she walked off the stage without a word, disappearing into the wings while the audience still clapped and called for an encore backstage. She found Harold Mills waiting for her with open arms. The old professor hugged her tightly. Not caring about propriety or professional distance, he told her he had never heard anything so beautiful in his entire life, that she had reminded him why he had devoted his life to music. Elena hugged him back and thanked him for believing in her, for pushing her to find the courage she had lost so many years ago in the recital hall. The audience was buzzing with questions and speculation. Who was this woman? They asked each other. Where had she come from? Why was she working as a cleaning lady at the academy? Some of the older patrons, those who had been following classical music for decades, were beginning to recognize something familiar in what they had just witnessed. One elderly man in a tuxedo was already on his phone, searching for videos of Elena Marquez de Vita, comparing the face on his screen to the woman who had just left the stage. It would not take long for the truth to come out, for the world to learn that the Spanish Flame had never truly been extinguished. But for now, in this moment, Elena stood backstage and let herself feel something she had not felt in 30 years, hope. And somewhere, in a place beyond grief and loss and time itself, Elena could almost hear Isabella laughing with joy, and she could almost see Antonio nodding with pride, the way he always did when she played her best. The music had come back to her, and with it, the first fragile promise that healing might be possible after all. By the time Elena arrived home that night, her life had already begun to change in ways she could never have imagined. Someone in the audience had recorded her performance on their phone and posted it to social media before she even left the building. Within an hour, the video had been shared thousands of times, and by midnight it had gone viral around the world. The headline that appeared on every major news website was almost identical. Lost piano legend found working as janitor. Music critics who had written about Alina Marquez de Vidal decades ago were suddenly being contacted for interviews, asked to explain who this woman was and why her disappearance had been such a mystery. Newspapers ran side-by-side photos of the young Alina in her red dress at Carnegie Hall and the older Alina in her simple black dress at Hartwell Academy television. Reporters camped outside the academy the next morning, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Spanish flame. Alina refused to speak to any of them, slipping out through a back entrance with Harold's help and retreating to her apartment. But she could not hide forever, and she knew that her 30 years of anonymity were over. The phone calls started coming almost immediately. From concert halls and record labels and journalists all over the world, everyone wanted to know where she had been, what had happened to her, why she had disappeared from the music world at the height of her career. Alina ignored them all at first. Overwhelmed by the attention and unsure of what she wanted to do next, she spent 3 days alone in her apartment, thinking about the past and the future and the strange turn her life had taken. During those 3 days, something remarkable happened at Hartwell Academy. Professor Margaret Thornton was called into an emergency meeting with the board of directors. The donors who had attended the gala were furious when they learned how Margaret had treated Alina, how she had tried to humiliate a member of the staff for her own amusement. They threatened to withdraw their financial support unless Margaret was removed from her position by Monday morning. Margaret Thornton had quietly resigned as director of the academy. Citing personal reasons, she packed up her office without saying goodbye to anyone and was never seen at Hartwell again. David Chen sought out Alina the day after the gala, finding her in the supply closet where she still went every morning out of habit. He stood in the doorway, unable to meet her eyes. His face red with shame, he told her he was sorry, truly deeply sorry, for every cruel thing he had said and done. He said he had been arrogant and blind, had judged her without knowing anything about who she really was. Then he did something that surprised Alina more than anything else that had happened in the past few days. He knelt down on the floor of the supply closet, right there on the dirty tiles, and bowed his head. He begged for her forgiveness, his voice cracking with emotion. Alina looked at this young man who had mocked her so mercilessly, and she felt something unexpected. She felt compassion. She reached out and touched his shoulder and told him to stand up, said that she forgave him. She said that everyone makes mistakes, and the true measure of a person is whether they have the courage to admit when they were wrong. David looked up at her with tears in his eyes and thanked her, promised to be a better person, a more humble teacher. He kept that promise in the years that followed, becoming known as one of the kindest instructors at the academy. 1 week after the gala, Hartwell Academy offered Alina a full professorship, complete with a generous salary and the title of Artist in Residence. The new director, a kind woman named Dr. Sarah Washington, personally delivered the offer to Alina's apartment. She said the academy would be honored to have such a legendary pianist on their faculty, that Alina could teach as much or as little as she wanted. Alina listened to the offer and thanked Dr. Washington sincerely for her kindness, but she turned it down. She said she had spent enough of her life performing for wealthy audiences in prestigious institutions. She wanted to do something different with the time she had left. Instead of joining the faculty at Hartwell Academy, Alina used the small amount of money she had saved over the years to rent a storefront in a poor neighborhood on the other side of Boston. She cleaned it up herself, painting the walls and sanding the floors and buying second-hand furniture. Then she put up a sign in the window that read, "Isabella's Music Studio," and she opened the doors to anyone who wanted to learn. Alina began teaching piano to children who could never afford lessons at a place like Hartwell Academy. She taught the children of immigrants, and the children of single mothers, and the children who lived in shelters and foster homes. She charged nothing, not a single penny, because she believed that music should be available to everyone, regardless of their wealth. Word spread quickly about the legendary pianist who was giving free lessons to poor children. Donations began to pour in from music lovers around the world who had seen her viral video and wanted to support her mission. Alina used the money to buy pianos for children who showed promise, instruments they could keep in their homes and practice on whenever they wanted. She named her program the Isabella Foundation, in honor of the daughter she had lost so many years ago. The little girl who had loved to dance while her mother played would have been proud. Alina thought sometimes, when she was teaching a particularly talented student, Alina would remember Isabella composing her first little song at the age of 4, and she would smile, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes in the months and years that followed. Alina gave occasional interviews to journalists who wanted to tell her story. She spoke openly about the accident that had killed her family, about the grief that had driven her into hiding, about the long road back to music. She said that she had spent 30 years running from the pain, believing that silence was the only way to survive, but she had learned that running from grief only made it stronger, only gave it more power over her life. The only way through sorrow, she said, was to walk straight into it, to let it wash over you and trust that you would still be standing when it passed. One interviewer asked Alina if she had any regrets about her 30 years of silence, about all the music she had not played and all the students she had not taught. Alina thought about the question for a long time before she answered. She said that she wished she had found the courage to play again sooner, wished she had not wasted so many years hiding from her own gifts, but she also said that perhaps everything happened the way that was meant to happen. Perhaps she had needed those 30 years in silence to understand what music really meant, what it was really for. Music is not about fame or competitions or selling out concert halls. She told the interviewer, music is about connection, about reaching into another person's soul and touching something true. It is about taking the deepest parts of yourself, the joy and the sorrow and the love and the loss, and transforming them into something beautiful that can be shared. Alina never performed in a major concert hall again, though she received hundreds of invitations. Instead, she gave small recitals at her studio, playing for audiences of children and their families, filling that little storefront with the kind of music that had once filled Carnegie Hall. And every recital ended the same way, with Alina playing a short, simple melody that a 4-year-old girl had composed many years ago. She would close her eyes and play Isabella's song, and somewhere in her heart she could feel her daughter dancing. The music had never really left her after all. Alina realized it had simply been waiting, patient and faithful, for her to remember why she had loved it in the first place. And now, at last, she remembered. The Spanish flame had returned, and she burned brighter than ever before.